Welcome to the second Pufendorf lecture, which will be on synchronic self-governance and synchronic plan rationality. Before I leave the word to Michael, I would just like to inform you about another exciting philosophy event in the building this evening. At 6:15, Anna-Sara Malmgren she's from Stanford.
She's my colleague. Michael. She's terrific.
She will give a talk on goodness, availability, and argument structure. And that talk is open for everyone, so you're all welcome. Please, Michael.
Okay. Let's see. It's wonderful to be here for a second time. There is a handout, which is basically just the slides for this talk. I will not talk about everything on the handout because there are more slides than I will actually use, but there they are. Because some of the details it's probably useful to have in front of you. Okay? Okay, so, let's see, is this working? Yes. Let's get our heads back into it. Here's a summary of some of the main ideas from the first lecture. We're going to try to see if we can explain why these basic planning norms will be reflectively stable for a reflective planning agent, where the main motivation for that, remember, was the thought that we needed to be able to show that to protect the explanatory theory from a kind of instability. I said the two-tier pragmatic theory had a lot going for it, in the sense that I think it's true that these structures of planning are extremely important in our lives. They're universal means, is the way I put it last time. But that by itself, what we learned from Jack Smart, I think, is that by itself doesn't get us the full justification of the application of these norms to a particular case, especially in hard cases, such as the case in which it looks like it might be a good thing to violate a consistency norm, say, by intending to get into Harvard and intending to get into Stanford, in the case I talked about last time. I said last time that what we're going to try to do is give the reflective planning agent something more to say, as Peter Strawson would have put it, in reflecting on these norms beyond the two-tier justification, something that enables the agent to see these norms as getting at a kind of coherence that isn't mere mental tidiness, which was the worry of the myth theorists. Something, an approach that helped us get at the commonalities underlying this kind of cluster of norms, and an approach that could answer John Broom's question about, is there a reason of a systematic sort, one that doesn't depend on the particulars of the ends intended and so on, for conforming to these norms. The thought is that if we can give this to the reflective planning agent, who's us after all, we will have put her in a position to see her norms as stable under reflection, and that will protect the planning theory from the challenge that I'm worried about. I said last time, and it will come up again today, that it seems to me not a good strategy here to try to say that there's a kind of substantive aim or end that's built right in constitutively to agency. That seems to me not sufficiently sensitive to the multivariousness of agency. So we can't try to justify these norms by appeal to some substantive constitutive aim or end. Instead, what we should do is think of that planning agent as looking for what I called last time, in honor of Gilbert Harman, inference to the best normative explanation of her planning norms, a kind of principled rationale for these norms, make them what helps you see what's going on normatively with those norms. I also pointed remember, one of the desiderata was the commonality desiderata, so that involved the idea that we would get an account of these norms that would work systematically, not just across the synchronic norms of consistency and coherence, but across some kind of substantive diachronic norm, though the exact form of that norm we left under-specified, because it's actually going to be a substantive question for these lectures, what that is. And what I said last time was some of the pressure for articulating a substantive diachronic norm that goes beyond the appeals to what I called last time snowball effects and rational non-reconsideration. The pressures for a substantive norm goes beyond that. At least the ones I'm talking about today, which is not to say this exhausts all the kinds of pressures, but anyway, today, for these lectures, come from these two kinds of cases. Questions about willpower that have been at the center of Richard Holton's work, questions about resisting what I call brute shuffling that are raised in John Broom's paper about Abraham and Isaac, though I talked about the Sartre young man, Mom, and the Free French. And then I suggested last time that a good strategy, and I think kind of the philosophically privileged strategy in response, is to think that at the rationale, to use Harman's term from last time, that underlies these norms is going to involve a kind of fundamental appeal to self-governance, which is not the idea that self-governance is somehow a constitutive aim of agency. That's an idea that's out there, but that's not what I'm appealing to. But I think normatively, that's where a reflective planning agent will end up. And that will give the reflective planning agent a kind of initial response to the myth theorist. This is going to come back, where the initial response is, the myth theorist says, what's the big deal about this kind of mental coherence? It's just tidiness. And the response is, well, there are kinds of coherence that are just tidiness, perhaps, but this isn't. The relevant forms of coherence at stake here are ones that are partly constitutive of something really important, self-governance. So it's not just a fetish for mental tidiness, it's a responsiveness to something really important. Okay, that's where we were last time. Okay, now, in saying that, I'm assuming that we can't just say, well, the kind of coherence involved in synchronic, I'm thinking now just about, so today the topic is primarily the synchronic norms. Okay, I should have said that more explicitly. In the background is the worry that what we say needs to have a kind of commonality with what we're going to say about a diachronic norm. But okay, today it's primarily, as the title suggested, the title of the lecture suggested, the synchronic norms. And just to respond to a possible, I thought you might have it. So why not just say that there's intrinsic normative significance of plan coherence? That's it. That's kind of fundamental thought. Why go beyond that? Now, there are two things I want to say about this. One is kind of dialectically, it feels like at this point we'd have a dialectical standoff with the myth theorist, because the myth theorist says, what's the big deal? And you say, no, that's what it is. So we're not making any progress, okay, dialectically. But secondly, there is an analogy here that might be helpful. So Scanlon talks about how to respond to what he calls Pritchard's dilemma, which has a certain similar structure to this. So the Pritchard's dilemma can put this way: if we want to explain why the moral wrongness of an action gives you any reason not to perform it, the dilemma is, on the one hand, you say, well, it gives you reason because it's wrong to do it. Okay, but that's not kind of getting any further. Or we could try to provide a different kind of reason. And then the question is, are we giving the wrong kind of reasons? You want to say, well, it's in your interest to do what morality tells you to do. But that looks like kind of, we're now giving the wrong kind of reason for doing what morality tells you to do. That was what Scanlon called Pritchard's dilemma. And Scanlon's strategy is let me read to you. He says, to look for an ideal of relations with others, which is clearly connected with the content of morality and at the same time has strong appeal when viewed apart from moral requirements. So we look for this kind of ideal that's not the same thing as morality, but it's clearly connected morality and has its own independent attractions. That's, in a way, the structure of the theory I'm going to give you. There are differences that we could talk about. In particular, it's not going to be part of my theory that every case, so there are going to be planning agents who don't have the capacity for self-governance. And for those agents, this kind of story I'm going to give you won't work. Whereas I think Scanlon is more ambitious and wants his ideal to apply to all cases of at least a kind of central version of morality. But the basic structure of what I'm going to say, which is to turn to something beyond planning agency in order to explain the norms of planning agency, has this structure. Okay, I hope that was helpful, but now I'm going to go on and see how it works. Okay, so we're going to look at the synchronic norms. And the idea is going to be that, let's see, where are we now? Okay. We're going to somehow try to give the reflective planning agent a rationale for these norms by identifying the relation between these synchronic norms and conditions of self-governance. Okay. So then the question is, well, what's self-governance anyway? Now, there's actually a very deep question about how to think about self-governance. It's almost impossible not to be tempted in thinking about self-governance to think about this self who's governing. And this self is this agent who's pulling the strings. Okay. But that can't be the fundamental, or can't is too strong because that's what Roderick Chisholm would say. But that if you want a model of self-governance that's kind of naturalistically embeddable, that's problematic because we want the kind of the dynamics of the agency to be not have a kind of fundamental role of this substance, the agent who's pulling the strings. And besides, we have to ask about, if we had this little agent in the background pulling the strings, we'd have to ask whether that agent was self-governing, and so now we'd have to have a little agent inside her, and we're off to the races. These are kind of standard worries about homuncular theories. Okay, so what we want is a model of self-governance that doesn't have a homunculus. And the philosopher who in many ways has done the most to help us with that is Harry Frankfurt. And Frankfurt's basic idea is think of self-governance this way. When there's a certain aspect of your psychology that constitutes your standpoint or where you stand, and when it guides, you govern. That's my way of putting it, not his, but it seems to me it's pretty much in the spirit. Frankfurt, this comes out in various ways in various works of Frankfurt. The original paper, of course, the famous paper about higher order desires and so on. But you don't need them higher ordered. You don't need to think that characterizing where the agents stand has to be in terms of orders of desire, which is what he thought in that original paper. You just need the more general basic insight that the way to think about a certain kind of freedom, or in the case I'm talking about self-governance, is to think about it as guidance by relevant aspects of the psychology. What are relevant aspects of psychology? Those that constitute the relevant standpoint of the agent. Okay. Now, for that to be a good for that to work as a model of self-governance, what you need is that the standpoint, where the standpoint now is not a little person inside, but a structure, a psychological structure, right? In Frankfurt's case, it was the original paper, that's what you'll know, is certain higher order volitions, right? That's not the picture I have, but it's going to have the same kind of functional structure. There's going to be elements of the psychology whose guidance constitutes your self-governance. Okay, and for that to work, there has to be an appropriate kind of coherence in the standpoint. Otherwise, there is, as it were, no place where you stand. If the basic framework involves fundamentally conflicting attitudes, where what counts as fundamentally conflicting is something that we have to theorize about, because there's room for lots of conflict, but certain kinds of conflict will undermine the sufficient unity of the standpoint such that we can say that when it guides, you govern. And we'll come back to that later. So the thought is, if you have this kind of Frankfurtian picture, think about self-governance as guidance by the standpoint that's sufficiently coherent, and where choices are also, where the choices cohere with the standpoint, and where I'll summarize that with those two ideas, coherence of the standpoint and coherence of choice of the standpoint, just by talking about standpoint choice coherence, and where there's guidance, where I understand this. I'm thinking of this as a kind of causal psychology, but that is maybe not absolutely required. You might have different ways of thinking about guidance for present purposes. I myself have a kind of causal picture, but in any case, there's a kind of guidance by the standpoint of choice. The standpoint is coherent. The choice coheres with the standpoint, is guided by the standpoint, and in the model, we're going to assume relevant capacities. So this isn't all just an accident. The agent has, in particular, a capacity that's going to matter later on, a capacity to make sure the standpoint is sufficiently shaped by her reflections. So it's adjustable. It's modifiable in light of reflection. Okay. So that's a kind of, you know, very preliminary Frankfurtian way of thinking about self-governance without a homunculus. And now this hope is we can use that because we have built into it crucial ideas of coherence, in particular that idea, the coherence of the standpoint. And the hope is we can use that to think of these norms as tracking that kind of coherence, which, when the model is partly constitutive of self-governance, which isn't just mental tidiness. Right, that's going to be the strategy. Now, here's how I'm going to proceed in trying to explain that. That is, so we have this model of self-governance, and now we're going to try to use it in developing a rationale available to the reflective planning agent for these synchronic norms. So we're imagining the synchronic planning agent, the reflective planning agent is reflecting on these synchronic norms is after the best normative explanation of our plan-infused practical thinking. In doing this now, the main focus now is going to be on whether and how she would try to satisfy the coherence desideratum, that is, find a form of coherence that isn't just, that prima facie has significance, isn't just simple mental tidiness. Going to bracket for now the worry that we have to address, and I will, and will actually shape the next couple of lectures really, the worry that we have to go beyond just finding a form of coherence that's being tracked. We have to explain what reason we have to cohere in that way. That's what I call the reason desideratum. But I'm putting aside for now. I'm going to imagine the reflective planning agent looking for a form of coherence that's being tracked by the synchronic norms and is at least prima facie plausibly not just mental tidiness. Okay. And the natural thought here is, well, it's the coherence conditions of self-governance. So the strategy will be the kind of the rationale underlying the synchronic norms, consistency of coherence, is what they're tracking a constitutive element of self-governance, and then we're going to have to explain why self-governance matters. But at least we've gotten beyond the worry, the myth theorist's worry that it's just a kind of mental tidiness. That's what I think we should say. I'm now going to try to say it in a little more detail, and to do that it actually gets complicated. So just hold that basic thought, because now we're going to get some complications, okay? Here's why I think there are complications. So let's see, where am I on my handouts here? Oh, there we are, qualifications. So I think it's kind of overstated to say anytime there's a kind of incoherence in your standpoint with respect to your action, that's a kind of irrationality. I mean, they're just trivial cases. I mean, if you know, I kind of think taking 101 is a slightly better route than taking 280 to San Francisco, and at the spur of the moment, I take 280. These norms of rationality are supposed to matter, and it just that these trivial cases, that kind of minimal lack of fit of your choice with your standpoint doesn't seem to matter. Then there are cases that do matter, extremely, kind of tragic conflict cases. So Sophie, in Sophie's choice, is kind of a natural case to appeal to. So Sophie has to decide. She's facing an awful choice, right, of which child to give up to the Nazi guard. There's just no way she's going to have a kind of coherent point of view on all this. Right. So I think I'm not going to suppose that in kind of these tragic cases that she's irrational because her standpoint isn't coherent. That's tragic. Okay. So I want to say that whatever the connection is between the kind of incoherence of standpoint that we're talking about and rationality is there's going to be a kind of defeasibility. Okay, this will come out later. I also want to allow for this idea that, well, suppose you there's a kind of breakdown of coherence in your standpoint because you intend some end and just can't get yourself to intend the means. I'm sure you've never had this experience, but procrastination sometimes takes this form. So there's a kind of incoherence. Maybe it's not so trivial that it's not blocked by the triviality worry. On the other hand, maybe for you to sort it out would take a lot of time and energy, and you're in the middle of something else very important or something like that. So I want to leave room for a kind of contrast between its being pro tanto irrational and its being all-in irrational. Okay. Where to say it's pro tanto irrational, I want to distinguish between pro tanto and prima facie. So these are terms that get used a lot. The way I understand them is prima facie is basically an evidential idea. Prima facie is this evidence kind of prima facie indicates that, but it can be a misleading indicator, right? Something could be prima facie evidence for it's going to rain, but it could be just it's not like it's raining a little bit when there's prima facie evidence that it's going to rain. It's that it's evidence that it's going to rain. It might be misleading, okay? Whereas to say there's a kind of pro tanto rational breakdown is to say there really is a rational breakdown. It just might not be all in irrational, okay? So that's how I'm understanding this terminology. And so the way I'm going to formulate these norms is going to exploit these ideas of defeasibility and pro tanto. And this is the way I'm going to try to do it. So this is a way of capturing now the idea that this reflective planning agent can appeal to coherence conditions of self-governance to make sense to herself of the synchronic norms. So the norm says something like this. If you're capable of self-governance, I should say, I forgot to say this before. This is the problem about doing it informally rather than reading it. The way I'm proceeding now, you'll notice, is intended to be fairly general about the relation between rationality and self-governance. I'm not requiring yet that the agent is a planning agent. I'm just supposing it's an agent who's reflective in some way. Okay. So right now, I'm just supposing that it's an agent is capable of self-governance. Then if you are capable of self-governance, then it's defeasibly, that's in there for the reasons I described, pro tanto irrational if you either fail to have a coherent practical standpoint or choose in a way that doesn't cohere with your standpoint. That's just basically capturing the thought that there's a connection between synchronic rationality and the kind of coherence that's partly constitutive of self-governance without putting it specifically in terms of planning. Okay. Okay. The thought is that though it's a qualified norm, it has a defeasibility built into it, it's about pro tanto irrationality, it's not just that the norm is a kind of potentially misleading indicator concerning what really matters. It really does say, unless it's defeated by certain kind of defeating conditions, there's something pro tanto, there's some kind of pro tanto breakdown if you have that incoherence. Now, why believe that? Well, the thought is that that's where that would be a natural place to start with anyway if you're engaged in this project of inference to the best normative explanation of these planning norms. Although here we're just thinking quite generally, we haven't talked specifically about planning, which we're about to do. Let me see now. Again, we still have in the background the reason desideratum is the worries of what reason do you have to conform to this thing. I'm not asking that question now. I'm just saying at this point you get to a point where here's a kind of coherence that's constitutive of something that seems like it matters, and it looks like a way of getting at what the breakdown would be in certain kinds of synchronic irrationality. To use this for our purposes, though, and I think at this point I'm here, right? No, don't worry about that. I mean, you can look at it in the handout. It's kind of interesting, but we're going to move on. As I said, that original principle was formulated in terms of a self-governed agent, not necessarily a self-governed planning agent. But our real interest is in self-governance of a planning agent, since our real interest is in the norms that are specific to planning agency. So we need to say something about self-governed planning agency. Remember, on my view, which is this kind of version of Gricean creature construction, there are various kinds of agency, and planning agency is a very specific kind. It just happens to be the kind that, as far as I can tell, is really important that we are. Okay. Okay. Now, to think about self-governed planning agency, we need to think about some ideas that I introduced briefly last time, and I'll introduce them briefly again. The role that planning structures play in our agency. So the thought is, well, you have these plans, they settle on options, like I settle back in January, whether in June you're going to Sweden. They have a kind of cross-referential structure in the sense that my intention in January to go to Sweden in June has a kind of implicit reference to later intentions, which then, when I execute them, if things go well, at least implicitly refer back. I'm now following through on my intention that I had in January. These plans, these cross-referential structures frame our thinking. That was one of the ideas I introduced right at the beginning. So I have this plan. It has this kind of cross-temporal structure, these cross-references, and it poses problems. How am I going to get to Lund? Constrained solutions. Well, I can't go that day. I'm teaching, right? It seeks mesh in the sense that in these earlier plans, my intention is that I carry through in a way that meshes with the plans I've already formed, fits with the plans I've already formed. Prima facie, obviously, there's this issue of possibility of change, which goes back to the diachronic norms. We'll look at that later. And those ideas I think were there already in the first lecture, but something I don't think I said in the first lecture, but does seem to me quite important. It came up at dinner last night. There's something really striking about the way these plans work in our agency, which is there's a kind of Lockean structure here. That is, they're kind of, think about Locke on memory and its connection to personal identity. You've got these cross-referential things going on and continuities, and of course Locke famously thought that was at the bottom of personal identity over time. Well, you've got a kind of reflection of that in planning. You've got intentions that refer to future intentions that then refer back to them. You've got, if things go well, continuities of intention. It works because of the framing role. It kind of sets up a basic framework that continues over time and then frames deliberation as time goes by as you fill in the plans. So you could call these kind of Lockean identity contributing roles of plans. Okay. So the thought is that's a kind of quick version of the systematic role of these plans in our lives, and that given that kind of a very systematic role in structuring our agency over time, my thought is that's a justification for saying that your standpoint at a time is going to involve in a basic way your plans, because those are the things that are playing this big role in structuring your agency over time. They're really important for that, and so they, to use Frankfurtese, there's a case to be made for saying they speak for you at a time because they structure your agency over time in these very deep ways. And if you think of it that way, then remember the Frankfurtian strategy with respect to self-governance is find structures such that their guidance is your self-governance. And now the thought is, well, the structures that are such that their guidance is a planning agent, self-governance, will be plan-infused. Okay. That's not that. Okay. So now the thought is take that idea, mesh it with the more generic principle, PRSG. Now this is PRSG-P. And basically all we're doing is saying that for a planning agent, what has to be coherent is the plan-infused standpoint, because the plans are playing such a basic role in the psychology. So in a way, the real normative oomph is coming from the connection between self-governance and rationality that's posited by the original principle. This is just saying, and you know, for a planning agent, for the relevant standpoints are going to be plan-infused, so they better be coherent plan-infused standpoints, right? That's how we're getting from the more generic principle to the planning principle. Okay. Let's see where I am now. Right. So now, ultimately our goal was to give the reflective planning agent something to say in support of these specific norms of consistency and coherence of plans. So the strategy is going to be to see the kind, to go back here, let's see. Oh, no, I guess that's it. The kind of coherence of plan-infused standpoints that this principle refers to as precluding, normally, the kind of inconsistency or incoherence that's precluded by the synchronic norms. Okay, that's going to be the strategy. And the thought is that normally, anyway, inconsistency of plan, you know, when you plan to go to the dentist and plan to have lunch with your friend, or incoherence of plan, you plan to get to Lund, but you never get around to planning to buy a ticket. Okay, that's means and incoherence. Okay, either of those will normally baffle the kind of coherence of standpoint that we need for there to be a clear place where the agent stands. Where, remember, a clear place where the agent stands is what's involved in there being plan-shaped self-governance, because self-governance is going to be constituted by being guided by where you stand. Okay, that's the intuition that drives this effort to connect these general comments up with the specific norms of consistency and coherence. So I think there maybe we could put it in terms of three ideas here. Let's just take intention inconsistency flat out. So if you intend, I'll deal with generic, schematically here, intend A and intend B, you know that A and B, you believe or you know that A and B are not copossible, then that seems to me pretty clear. There's a thought here that, well, then there's no place you stand on the question with whether A or B. If I intend to go to the dentist and intend to be with my friend and know that I can't do both, so far there's a kind of lack of articulation about where I stand about the questions of friendship and dental health. Okay. So that kind of intention inconsistency, the argument is, undermines the kind of coherence that, though that's a kind of simple case, but undermines the kind of coherence that is needed for plan-infused self-governance. Okay. Second, what about the consistency constraint? Remember, included the idea not just about intending A and intending B while knowing those aren't copossible, but it also included the thought that you would be violating a consistency constraint if you intended A and believed not A. So if I intended to go to Lund and believed I wasn't going to go to Lund. This is a little more delicate, and in fact, what I'm about to say has been challenged quite powerfully by in a wonderful PhD thesis by Carlos Nunez at Stanford. But I think I still believe it, although Carlos is pushing me around quite hard here. But the thought is that if you intend something and believe you won't do it, this is different, by the way, what I'm about to say now is much weaker thought than the kind of thought that the cognitivists that I talked about last time tend to have. They tend to have the thought intending involves believing you're going to do it. Constitutively involves. Maybe it is a way of believing you're going to do it. That's what David Velleman thinks. But I don't believe that at all. But the consistency, the belief, intention, belief, consistency constraint does say there's a kind of rational breakdown if you intend something that you believe, not just you don't have to believe you'll do it, but that you believe you won't do it. Okay. And you can see how this would fit into the picture because the intention will be a basis for planning, but the belief that you won't do it will be a basis for planning. It looks like you're going to just get bounced about. I intend to go to Lund, so now I'll call up my Swedish relatives and tell them I'm going to be there. I believe I'm not going to Lund. I better call up my Swedish relatives and tell them I won't be there. And so I'm basically on the phone all the time. Put it that way. Okay. Third, what if you intend the end, but though you believe it's time to fish or cut bait, you don't intend the means, you intend to go to Lund. You know that the last chance to buy a ticket is midnight tonight. Here it is, 11:59 and 55 seconds. And you still haven't intended to buy a ticket, assuming that's possible, which it does seem to me it is possible. If you say, where do you stand with respect to going to Lund? I mean, there is no clear place you stand. So, and what we want in self-governance is a clear place where you stand. So means and incoherence is going to undermine the kind of coherence of standpoint that is needed for self-governance. That, anyway, is the basic argument. Let's see where I am. Yeah, that's the basic argument for the general thought that inconsistency or incoherence in plans are going to baffle the kind of coherence of standpoint that's involved in plan-shaped self-governance. Now, there's a complication here about preface analog cases. We all know about the writer who, in the preface, says, there's a lot of things I say here, they all seem to me to be true, but I'm quite sure that at least one of them's not. You know, the humble writer. Okay, that's sometimes called, there's something very, we all have this experience, but it also seems there's something puzzling because you have, your beliefs are strictly speaking inconsistent, right? Because you believe A, B, C, D, E, F, G, and you believe not the conjunction, okay? There's going to be plan theoretic analogs of that. I actually thought about that in an older paper, and Sam Spall has a new paper that worries a lot about this, where you have a vacation, you have all these things you're planning to do on your vacation. Each one of them, none of them are such that you plan to do it and believe you won't. But if you put them all together, I mean, life being what it is, what you believe is, I'm not going to get them all done. You know, I'm not going to do it all. Life being what it is, excuse me. So there's a kind of preface paradox analog. Because of that, it seems to me we're going to want to kind of further defeasibility in the norm when we state it. And I'll tell you what that is in a minute. But I do want to emphasize that I don't think that extends to the kind of simpler cases like the Harvard-Stanford case. So, I mean, someone who intends to get into Harvard and intends to get at Stanford, knowing that they coordinate admissions and so you can't do both, that would violate the consistency norms. Okay. It would be like an author who has a book with 2 sentences and then says in the preface, well, at least one of them's false, right? I mean, that author needs to adjust one of those sentences, right? Or maybe both, right? Okay. So so this is like a really short book, and I think the worries about a kind of preface analog cases don't undermine the basic thought that I started with before, which is these kind of straightforward cases of intension and consistency really are rational breakdowns. Okay. Now, the way I want to accommodate this complexity is to say, well, we already had a kind of defeasibility built in by noticing that there are these trivial cases and tragic cases. There's another kind of defeasibility when you get this kind of preface analog case, and there's probably a lot more to say about it, but I'm just going to assume that we can think of it this way, and here's how I want to formulate the norm. And this is kind of the version of the consistency coherence norms that we wanted to be able to give an account of, right? So if you're a planning agent who's capable of self-governance, it's doubly because of the 2 kinds of defeasibility that I was introducing, proton to a rational view, to have plans that are inconsistent or means and incoherent given your beliefs. So the thought now is we've kind of grounded PC, we've grounded the demands for consistency and coherence in their connection to the kinds of coherence constitutively involved in a planning agent's self-governance, and that's what we wanted to do. Let's see now. Okay, so that's part of the story, but we haven't been worried about what reason you have to conform to PCC. We've just tried to say that if you're this planning agent who's trying to ground these norms in self-governance, this is the way it would look. Now, what reason would you have to conform to PCC? Well, think about how this kind of theory should proceed. The natural thing to say is, well, what we've shown is that the plan consistency and coherence norms are tracking a kind of coherence that's partly constitutive of self-governance. So if you have a reason to be self-governing, then, and I'll add a second premise that's going to matter, and you have it in your power, it's available to you to be self-governing, then putting aside some complexities that we can maybe talk about, it looks like you can, that reason for self-governance if you had it, together with its being available to you, the self-governance, you can, it's a real possibility. It looks like the reason for self-governance will transmit to a reason of self-governance to conform to the necessary constitutive elements of self-governance that are these forms of coherence. That is the kind of natural way that this self-governance strategy is going to respond to the effort to satisfy the reason desideratum. Okay, it's going to say, well, if you have the capacity for self-governance and you do have a reason to govern your own life, I haven't said that why you do that, but that reason, if the self-governance is attainable, then it's going to transmit to a reason of self-governance in favor of a consistency and coherence of plans, because the consistency and coherence of plans are partly constitutive of the self-governance of a planning agent. That's what the metaphysics of self-governance was supposed to argue for. Now, let's see. In particular, a kind of sub-principle of PCs of these principles of plan consistency and coherence, we could put as ME, because this is the one that's going to be particularly salient. Now it's a way of formulating the means end coherence principle. You satisfy ME either by, let's assume the knowledge about M being a necessary means, and that N, you only do M if you actually intend it. Let's hold that fixed, and so you satisfy ME by intending the end and intending the means, or by not intending the end at all, and so you don't have to intend the means. Okay. In that sense, this is a kind of norm that to use John Broom's terminology, it has a kind of wide scope. Doesn't specifically say if you intend the end. Doesn't specifically say to intend the means. It says if you intend the end, then you can do two things. You can intend the means, or you can give up the end. Okay. And then let's see. Now, where am I? Okay. No, okay. So now what I was trying to convince you of is, if we have a reason for, if the planning agent has a reason for her self-governance, and the self-governance is available to her, attainable by her, she'll have a reason of self-governance to conform to these demands of consistency and coherence, in particular to conform to ME. Okay. So we're imagining that there's a reason of self, that is, on the assumption, which I haven't defended, that the agent has a reason for her self-governance, and that the self-governance is attainable, there's a reason of self-governance to conform to ME. And now the thought is, and this is in the spirit of John's work, that reason, this is where I was before, that reason doesn't tell you, if you intend the end, doesn't tell you specifically to intend the means. It says, well, if you intend the end, you've got two things. You can intend the means, conform to the reason, or you can give up the end. Okay, and that's important because there's a worry in the background that if E is something really nasty, so let's go back to Iago. What he intends is to destroy Otello. Okay. The thought is, we want to be able to say Iago's intention structure is under the constraint of ME, and there's a reason to conform to ME on these assumptions here, but that reason doesn't get you automatically a reason for him to deceive Otello. It's a reason to conform to ME, and there are two ways of doing it. One is deceiving Otello, another is giving up the end of destroying Otello. And the reason has this kind of wide scope. It doesn't automatically give you a reason just for the means, and that seems an attractive feature of this picture. Now, let me see. there's actually a puzzle here, I think. So what I just said was an expression of this hope. So we have this reason in favor of ME, where the reason is grounded in the reason for self-governance. But we don't get ourselves into a kind of odd bootstrapping situation in which the intention to destroy Otello gives Iago a reason to deceive him, to deceive Otello. Okay, because the reason has this wide scope, and there's two ways he could go. One is give up the end, the other is to take the means, and the reason itself doesn't automatically latch on to each of the disjuncts, as it were. Okay. But this actually, there's a kind of puzzle because that forces us to think more carefully about this reason of self-governance. So this is all kind of hypothetical thinking in the sense that in the background, the reason of self-governance for conforming to this norm, PME, is we're supposing it's there because we're supposing the planning agent has a reason for her self-governance, and it transmits, okay, to a reason of self-governance for the necessary constitutive elements of the self-governance, which the argument was this is a conforming to this is a necessary constitutive element of self-governance. But how to think about that reason exactly? Here are two ways to think about it, one of which seems to me the right way. One is it's a reason to, as it were, get as much self-governance as possible, to maximize self-governance, so that you're kind of not conforming to the reason when you take a nap. Right? You're missing a chance, another chance to be self-governing. Okay. That, when you think of it that way, then actually there might be a kind of, we might be stuck with a kind of bootstrapping in Iago's case, because if there's two ways he has to conform to ME, he's already intending to destroy Otello. One way to conform to ME is to intend the means, deceive Otello. Another way is to give up the end, okay? But on the assumption that you could be evil and self-governing, that self-governance is consistent with really nasty ends, okay? Which seems to me true, but you could challenge that. But I'm making that assumption now. It looks like there's a kind of asymmetric pressure in favor of the means rather than giving up the end, if the reason is a reason to maximize self-governance, because he intends to destroy Otello. Now he's got these two options. One is give up the end. Well, then he's not self-governing at all. The other is the means, settle on the means. Well, now he gets a little bit of self-governance. So if the reason is the reason of maximizing self-governance, then it looks like that reason might actually give you kind of asymmetric pressure in favor of intending the means, and that might reintroduce this kind of worry that this kind of reason for this kind of general coherence is going to end up bootstrapped, going to give us, if you have intentions in favor of bad things, reasons in favor of the means to the bad things, which is what we were hoping to avoid. That was the hope. So it seems to me the right thing to say is that the reason of self-governance that we should be talking about here has a kind of conditional structure. If the reason says, insofar as you're involved in a certain kind of activity, so to speak, you've got a dog in play here. You've got something going. Insofar as you're involved in this activity, the reason says be self-governing in that activity. But one way to respond to that reason is not to get involved in the activity, which is what you're doing when you're taking a nap, or what Iago could do by dropping the end. So it's not a reason to maximize self-governance as much as insofar as you're proceeding along, be self-governing. And I think that will be the right way to think about the reason in favor of ME that actually I'm getting at, that doesn't kind of get us into this kind of indirect bootstrapping problem because of the worry I had before that if it's a reason to maximize self-governance, that's what will happen. Okay, we can come back to that in Q&A. I'm running out of time here, and I want to be sure to get a couple other things. Now, so we're still working with this idea that we have a kind of preliminary argument that there is a reason of self-governance to conform to the plan consistency and coherence demands. We haven't filled in the argument because we haven't explained the nature of the reason for self-governance. But before we can go any further, we need to address a general worry that's been expressed, especially by Kieran Sedia, following up on some ideas of Patricia Greenspan, about the very idea of a reason to conform to ME. Remember what we said was, now we introduced the conditionality of the reason to avoid a problem, but the idea was going to be a reason to conform to this, the reason of self-governance to conform to this, was going to be this wide scope reason. It doesn't automatically give you a reason for the means, it gives you a reason for the disjunction, but not a necessary reason for each of the disjuncts. Give up the end or intend the means. We structured the reason as a conditional reason to avoid this worry that you might kind of back in to a kind of asymmetric reason in favor of specifically intending the means. That's what we did here by turning to a conditional reason. But the Sedia worry is a different worry. The worry is, what if the end itself isn't really subject to change by the agent herself? It's an unmodifiable end. Maybe it's a obsession of some kind. It's an end that you've got, but you can't change. Maybe a cigarette smoker has this experience. Okay. If the end is non-modifiable, then, Sedia thinks, you get this kind of inference. One is a way of expressing the reason that we said we had ME. The reason in favor of that is where this is kind of shorthand for ME. If you intend the end, intend the means. That's what I mean. The second premise is, well, but you can't really give up the end. It's an obsessive end of some kind, or non-modifiable end. And I'm going to assume with Sedia there are cases like that in which you have an intention in favor of something where that intention itself is not changeable in light of your reflection. And then Sedia worried, well, in that case, the only way you can satisfy the conditional here is by intending the means, because giving up the end is not available to you because of premise 2. Okay. So that's a kind of that's a challenge in the background to the claim that I was trying to defend, that we really do have a reason of self-governance modulo some of the conditions that we haven't filled in yet to conform to that. So I need to say something about that, and what I want to say is this, that if you think about how the theory understands this reason, remember, it's derived from a reason for self-governance. So this reason, if I fill this in, would be practical reason of self-governance for this, right? And that reason is derived from the reason for self-governance. Remember the little argument. You have a reason for self-governance. The self-governance is attainable. Then you have a reason for the necessary constitutive elements of self-governance. Means and coherence is a necessary constitutive element of a planning agent self-governance. So you have a reason of self-governance for means and coherence. That was the little argument we went through. But notice that that argument required that your self-governance be attainable, because a reason for self-governance doesn't get you a reason of self-governance for the necessary constitutive elements of self-governance unless self-governance is attainable. That's what I was assuming. There's a general point that a reason for X gets you to a reason for necessary constitutive elements of X only on the assumption that X is attainable. Okay. But the Sedia example is exactly the sort of example in which the self-governance isn't attainable. If you really have this kind of compulsion, that's going to undermine the kind of underlying capacity to adjust your intentions in light of reflection that was part and parcel of being self-governing, if you go back to the Frankfurt model we got. So it's not, so putting aside some complexities, basically what I want to say about the Sedia worry is, if condition 2 is true, then condition 1 will be false. So the argument won't be sound. Conditional 1 will be false because you won't have a reason of self-governance to be means and coherent, because that reason depends on the transmission of the reason for self-governance to the necessary constitutive elements of self-governance, and that transmission requires that you have the capacity for self-governance, but you don't if 2 is true. Okay, so that's my response to SETI. I saw the puzzled faces, but what are you going to do? Okay, so let's see. Well, okay, so let me say this. So now we're getting to the $32 question. That whole discussion, so this kind of various kinds of things going on, right? The original argument for PCC is grounded in the conditions of self-governance. That was all I kind of said. Let's put aside the reason desideratum. Let's just see that what's this theory of what's underlying these synchronic norms is they're tracking a kind of coherence that isn't just mental tidiness. It's tied to self-governance. That's what got us to PCC. Okay. Then we said, what reason would you have to conform to PCC? Because ultimately, to establish PCC, and so these norms, the planning norms, we need to satisfy the reason desideratum. Okay, we meaning reflective planning agent. The argument was, well, if we have a reason to govern our own lives, then if self-governance is available, it will transmit to a reason of self-governance for the necessary constitutive elements of self-governance. And what the metaphysics told us was a necessary constitutive element of a planning agent self-governance includes means and coherence. But then we, as I said before, now we need to say, well, do we have a reason to govern our own lives? Well, it seems intuitively we do, but that's not enough for me. Partly because, remember, the framework I'm working with is the reflective planning agent is thinking about reasons as somehow anchored in her ends. So I need to say what the status is of the end of synchronic self-governance. Why can we assume, or can we assume, that the reflective planning agent will have that end? I need that end, or she needs that end, to ground the reason for self-governance, which, by way of this argument, will ground the reason of self-governance to conform to these synchronic norms, which is what we want, and doesn't get us into SETI's problem, and doesn't get us into the other problems so long as we think of the reason as a conditional reason. That's where we are, right? So now we're here. What about this end? Okay. I haven't said anything to convince you that that there's a kind of necessity to that end. And in fact, in eschewing the strategy of appealing to a constitutive end of agency, I was giving up that idea. There are philosophers who say, well, of course you have the end because you're an agent. Okay, that doesn't seem to me to work. It also doesn't seem to me to work to notice that, well, we are assuming, and actually, so here is an assumption that's just kind of pervading my discussion, that self-governance is a good thing. Okay, now we could argue about that too, right? But you got to start somewhere. So I'm taking that self-governance is a good thing. Okay. I haven't said good for the agent, just good thing. Okay. But that doesn't get us the end in general, because there's just too many goods. Life's short, too many goods. The fact that if you recognize something as a good thing, I don't think there's any kind of failure of rationality in not embracing it as an end. Just, I mean, Schoenberg's music is good music, but you know, I have too many other things to do. So, no offense to Schoenberg. So these two kind of quick ways of getting to the assumption that the agent has the end of self-governance don't work, I think. I think this poses one of the problems that's going to frame, I mean it is, you know, this poses one of the problems that's going to frame the next couple of lectures. The problem is, what's the status of the end of self-governance? Okay. And the solution that I'm going to propose is going to be also motivated by the other problem, which was the commonality condition. So think of it this way. The commonality condition was we want an explanation of these norms that explains their connection, which kind of connects up the underlying normative story, both with respect to the synchronic norms and the diachronic norm, and also maybe helps us formulate the diachronic norm. So we're going to have to look, which is no surprise for planning theory, we're going to have to look at rationality over time, self-governance over time. We're going to have to look about we've been focusing today on the at a time, rationality and self-governance at a time. We're going to have to look over time. And we have to do it anyway because of the commonality condition. My conjecture is that when we do it, when we start looking at not just planning agency at a time, but the rationality over time, and self-governance not just at a time but over time, we're going to get the resources to give a fairly robust, to make a fairly robust claim about the end of self-governance. I don't think we can do it just by thinking about the synchronic case, but when we think about the diachronic case, I'm going to argue we can. But that's coming attractions. Okay, just about over, so let me very quickly say one thing that was going to come at the end. You might be worried, this is actually something that Sarah Paul was very worried about when I talked to her about this. If you remember, there's this kind of dual structure of the things I'm saying. I didn't say the two-tier pragmatic theory is a mess. I think it's actually very insightful. It just doesn't suffice because of Smart's problem. Okay. So we've got these two justificatory structures that I'm supposing are in the head of a reflective planning agent, the two-tier pragmatic story and the self-governance stuff. And today we worked through in gruesome detail how the self-governance arguments could support these synchronic norms. But now you might wonder, what's the relation between these two forms of justification? That would be a fair question. So let me just assert how I think about it given the time, and then we can talk about it if you want. The way I think about it is this. The self-governance story is a way of seeing why, in the particular case, there really would be something at stake in violating the norm that's not just a matter of its being a norm that in general kind of pays. There's something specific at stake in the particular case. So it seems to me in proposing norms with respect to which we can ask about whether they have a kind of two-tier pragmatic rationale, norms that are such that their general acceptance would be good, okay, we're going to want to constrain those norms so that the agent, in applying the norm in a particular case, will not be pushed around by worries about her self-governance. Okay. So it seems to me the right way to think about the connection between these two justificatory structures is it's a kind of side constraint on these norms that they get supported by the self-governance argument. And so if a norm doesn't, so we want norms that are responsive to this kind of self-governance argument, and then we ask whether or not, given it's responsive to that, it's got a kind of two-tier pragmatic rationale. So in particular, this is important because, let's see where we were. I think this is, if you go back to Harvard and Stanford, consider a norm that said, yeah, it's okay if you can do better by intending inconsistent things, then do it. Okay. Now, we might ask, of course, don't do it unless you can do better. Something like that. Okay. The problem with that norm is going to be that it doesn't. In conforming to that norm, you could end up with intentions that undermine the coherence that's needed for your self-governance. That's been the argument of today, and so that norm wouldn't be responsive to the self-governance argument. So we're not going to even look at what the general acceptance of what the pragmatic impact of the general acceptance of that norm would be. It kind of fails an initial test. Okay. So the way I'm thinking about the relation between these two justificatory structures is that the self-governance structure has this kind of psi constraint, imposes a kind of psi constraint on which norms we then consider for the pragmatic two-tier rationale. Okay, that was a bit of a footnote, but I wanted to make that clear. Okay, so where we are then is a bit up in the air. That is, we've got, I hope I convinced you, you can kind of see how we, or reflective planning agent, could see the connection between these synchronic norms and the constituent elements of self-governance. You could see how that would be an initial response to the myth theorists, because it's not just mental tidiness, it's a kind of coherence that's tied to something we might well care about, self-governance. Okay. We can see how, were there a reason to be self-governing, we would solve the problem of the reason to conform to these norms, if self-governance is available. But we haven't really understood deeply enough why we would expect the planning agent to have a reason for self-governance, given the understanding of reasons is tied to ends. And the conjecture that I mentioned last time, that I'll follow up with next time, is the way to make progress with that, and at the same time be responsive to the commonality requirement, which was to try to get a systematic story about both the synchronic and diachronic case, is to look very seriously at self-governance, not just at a time, which is what we've been looking at, but over time. And that's what we'll do next time. Okay.
Okay, we have time for questions.
Are you going to, Bjorn, are you going to call on people? Yeah. Yeah, great.
John Broom.
Thank you. So we're going to found the basis for coherence of attitudes on self-governance, and the idea is we're going to treat self-governance as a matter of what you do, issuing from your own attitudes, which have to form enough of a unit that it can count as you
governing
it. Yeah, you governing. So suppose that you intend to get into Stanford and you intend to get into Harvard. And you get into Harvard. Now, your getting into Harvard has issued from an attitude of yours. In fact, it's presumably been caused by an attitude of yours, namely your intention of getting into Harvard, which happens not to have been consistent with another one. But at any rate, intuitively, we wouldn't say, oh, well, you weren't self-governing. We wouldn't say, oh, it's not down to you that you got into Harvard. You know, it's just good luck that you got into Harvard or something like that. We really would attribute it to you. We wouldn't think that your self-governance had been defeated just because you happened to have a intention that was in conflict with the one that actually brought you to Harvard.
Good. Yeah. So I agree with about half of that. I certainly agree that in the right, if you tell the story right, you can get into Harvard intentionally, if that's where you get in. And you can get into Stanford intentionally. Okay. In earlier work, that's what led me to say that you could do something intentionally without, strictly speaking, intending to do it. Okay. So we don't want to get confused. If you both intend to get into Harvard and intend to get into Stanford, and suppose you're kind of independently filling out the application forms, and it works for Harvard, but because they coordinated admissions, it doesn't work for Stanford, then that's your action. You do intentionally get into Harvard. You certainly were intentionally trying to get into Harvard, and I'm perfectly comfortable with saying you intentionally get into Harvard. There was a kind of conflict in attitude with respect to getting into Harvard. And the question is, why does that have anything to do with whether or not you were self-governing in getting into Harvard? That's it, yeah. And just to give more grist for your mill, we certainly, and I kind of said this en passant, we don't want the idea of, so the kind of underlying model of self-governance is you govern, your governance consists in the guidance by a coherence standpoint. Its guidance is your self-governance, right? Okay. And we want the idea of a coherent standpoint to allow for tensions within the standpoint, because life's complicated, and we frequently have to make decisions in the face of conflicting goods, and even the original Frankfurt version of this, you could be self-governing despite the fact that you were acting contrary to your first-order desire of some kind, say to get the drug or something in the original paper. So the idea is not that any conflict blocks self-governance. So I need to explain why strictly a conflict of intentions is a serious enough breakdown in unified perspective, right? And that's where the wow, it's a long way back, isn't it? No, it's this. That's where this came in. There we go. Okay. So I'm not appealing. So you were appealing to intuitions. Will we say he's self-governed or not? Okay. Myself, I don't. At this point, the notion of self-governance is sufficiently theoretically loaded. I'm not sure. The intuitions that I think I'm comfortable with are ones about, well, was he acting intentionally? Was it in his control? It wasn't his control, up to a point. I mean, he did it. It wasn't a kind of bolt from the blue. All that stuff, and all that stuff, I'm perfectly prepared to say about getting into Harvard. Okay. What kinds of conflicts matter to self-governance? I'm not leaning on kind of specific intuitions about cases like this, but on the thought that, well, you need these are the attitudes that are framing your practical life. Unlike, say, the original Frankfurt case, the desire for the drug or something, which you act contrary to when you act of your own free will because of your desire, the desire for the drug, not be your will, just to go back to the Frankfurt stuff. The point of this kind of structure of plans is to provide this kind of unifying, structuring, systematic framework to your thinking over time, your action over time. And that's my argument for saying that, I mean, the idea of self-governance is, we've got this idea of self-governance, then we have this Frankfurtian model of it, which is guidance by a sufficiently coherent standpoint. And then we have the plan theoretic interpretation of that model, which is, for a planning agent, what that involves is guidance by this plan-infused structure. And the reason the plan infusion really has this role to play, this kind of deep role to play in self-governance, is the organizing role they play in the temporal extension of your life, where that organizing role is what I was kind of trying to articulate here. That's the best I can do. Yeah. Okay.
Tony Renaud Rasmussen.
Thank you. Yeah, I have a question of clarification. Just a minor comment on the good and good for issue. So, I mean, given the fact that you actually say that you're assuming that there can be malicious sort of self-governance, no?
Yeah, Iago could be self-governing.
Yeah.
Yeah,
so,
as far as I can tell.
So then it seems to me that it would be intuitively more plausible to say that self-governance would be good for this agent rather than to say that it's good.
I'm sorry, say that again.
To say that it would be good for him to have self-governance rather than to say that it's good, period. But be that as it may, I mean.
Oh, both of those could be true. Yeah, I don't know about good for. I'll defer. I just don't know exactly what to say there. But what I need in the way I've set it up is just self-governance in itself is a good thing. It may also be good for him.
Despite its content, despite the fact that it's sort of...
Well, okay, so that is the tricky part. I'm thinking it's a good thing, which... I guess I'm thinking of the way, maybe, is this right? I mean, courage is a good thing that in a certain context can have very bad results. Self-governance is a good thing that in a certain context can have very bad results. That's how I'm thinking about it. Anyway, that's what I'm thinking. So if you go back to this kind of effort to understand reasons in a way that's appropriate for my project as tied to ends that are desirable or good, that's I'm thinking that self-governance will pass the goodness test. Yeah.
Fine. No, the question of clarification concerned, I'm not quite sure. So when you have this agent that's facing the wide scope reason, no? And he could go two ways. He could either sort of reject the end or go for the means, no?
Yeah.
So what I'm wondering is whether, to what extent you look upon this as a sort of an expression of self-governance in itself.
Oh, I see.
Because you were saying that there was at least one case in which choosing the means were sort of maximizing self-governance. No? But I would say that surely, I mean, what you do there is an expression of self-governance. No? Or maybe
because you're the one who's making the choice. Is that the idea? Yeah.
Yeah.
I haven't really I think I can just sidestep that. And here's why. What I need is the idea that conformity to these synchronic norms is a necessary constitutive element of self-governance. I don't need to say that there isn't an intuitive idea of self-governance in kind of deciding which to do. But if you fail to conform, and this actually is getting back to John's question, the thought is that kind of planning coherence does block self-governance. Okay, that's all. Whether or not there's something else we could talk about, which is the kind of the activity of choice. But that kind of incoherence blocks self-governance, and that's what I need to make the whole thing work. Yeah, okay.
Ingvar Johansson.
I would like you to say some more words about two concepts. The first one is degree of self-governance. Suddenly you spoke about maximizing self-governance.
Yeah,
and
I
you
spoke
speak
about that in order to
as much.
put it aside, remember, just to be clear. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. I apologize. Yeah.
Yeah. Just if you could say some general words about it, because I became a bit confused. It's easy to think about degrees of self-governance if you bring in compulsions. So one person who has some compulsions is less self-governing than another one who can choose more of his or her ends. But speaking about maximizing, seems to you build into the very planning agency itself some kind of degree of self-governance. So if you could say some words more about
Okay, yeah. Well, you're basically giving me more reason to be skeptical about this idea of getting as much self-governance as possible, which I'm skeptical about. Yeah, that is, I introduced that because I was worried about a problem, and maybe I'm wrong. Maybe there isn't this problem, but let me just make it clear what the problem was I was worrying about. Up to a point, I was saying, okay, so this argument from a reason for self-governance to a reason of self-governance to satisfy a necessary constitutive element of self-governance gets you a reason of self-governance to conform to this. So that's where we were, okay? And then, in drawing from John Broom's work, I was saying, well, okay, I'm thinking of this as a wide scope reason that says, you know, conform to it as you, holding fixed the cognitive parts of it, you conform to it by intending the end and intending the means, or you conform to it by giving up the end. And the wide scope reason doesn't give you a reason, doesn't automatically give you a reason specifically for one or the other. So I was thinking of that as a virtue of the theory, that the reason of self-governance would have a structure of the sort that that John has emphasized, that it could be a kind of wide scope reason to conform to this. But then what I worried, that was the hope, right? And then I said, well, this is kind of problem. Maybe I could be wrong that there's this problem, but I thought there was a problem. And the problem was, if you think of the reason of self-governance that I'm claiming we can get to conform to this as a reason that says, get as much self-governance as possible. And then you notice something funny. There's a kind of asymmetry. If you intend the end, we were thinking, well, there's kind of symmetry in ways of satisfying this. You ME. You either intend the means or you give up the end. It's kind of symmetric. There are two different ways of doing it, and the reason doesn't privilege one or the other. It just says it's a reason for the disjunction, not a reason for either of the disjuncts. Okay, that was the picture, and I wanted that picture because of this hope that I wouldn't end up, because of that reason, saying that Iago has a reason to deceive Otello. Okay, good. Given that he has the end of. But the worry I had was, if the reason of self-governance is a reason to get as much self-governance as possible, then there's a way in which there's an asymmetry built in, because if Iago gives up the end, then there's no self-governance, at least of the sort I'm talking about. This may actually connect up to Tony's question. But if he has the end and intends the means, then there's a kind of structure, the coherent structure whose guidance would be his self-governance. So I worried that a reason to maximize self-governance would asymmetrically support intending the means rather than giving up the end, but I didn't want that asymmetric support. So that's why I said, don't think of the reason of self-governance as a reason to maximize self-governance. Think of it as conditional. Insofar as you're involved in the activity, the reason says, do it in a way that's self-governing. And there's two ways of responding to that reason. And one is, give up the activity. Okay, that was the idea. So, I think there's no disagreement here, but you're giving further.
Some words.
Okay, good.
Some.
Yeah.
The other question popped up in my mind in relation to your slide that has the title "Plan Consistency, Coherence 2." If you can, where you speak about intending.
Yeah. There's a number on that. Can you tell me what the number is?
No, there's no number.
At the bottom, doesn't it show up in the? Maybe it didn't show up in the printout. Is that it? Is that? I'm sorry.
No. Plan consistency, coherence 2.
13? Okay, good.
Yeah.
Is that it? Good. Got it.
Yeah,
okay. Yeah.
Could you repeat and elaborate what you said about how you are using the very concept of intention? Because as I remember it, I remember that I reacted. Isn't that an odd way of speaking about intentions?
Which one?
Yeah, the way you can
up there.
Yeah,
Oh, well.
You said
this
something.
This is not my theory about what it is to have an intention. I'm supposing that what it is to have an intention is given that insofar as I've given you the resources to think about that, it's the planning theory. So intentions are states in the planning system, and they have contents. And the contents they have are partly articulated by the role of the state in the system. It tends to guide action towards A. It tends to guide reasoning in the direction of A. It tends to block certain other kinds of attitudes with respect to things that are not compatible with A, so on. This is this kind of broadly functionalist picture of intention that's built into the planning theory. But the functionalism involves this normative guidance, the idea that the way the system works is being responsive to your implicit acceptance of the norms that we're talking about. That's why it's so important to me to give a rationale for those norms, because if the norms look like they're just myths, the explanatory model is getting challenged. Okay, so that's how I understand intention. Okay, now then I say, well, these norms impose constraints on those things. They say don't have intention A and intention B when you know that if A, then not B. And at this point, I'm trying to convince you that here's the cool thing about those constraints. What they're tracking, I'm giving this to the reflective planning agent. What those constraints are tracking is the kind of coherence of standpoint you need to be self-governing in that domain. That's the solution, or at least the initial solution, the initial response to the myth theorist who thinks those norms are just tracking mental tidiness. So that's what's going on here. So this isn't trying to tell you what intention is. This is assuming we've already got a theory about what intention is, namely mine. So give me that because it's my talk. and then trying to convince you that the underlying norms, whose acceptance is doing all this guiding role in the theory, are tracking the kinds of coherence constraints that are built into the metaphysics of a planning agent's self-governance. That's what's going on there. Fair enough? Is that okay?
Yeah,
good. Okay.
Bengt Hansson.
Okay, I have one big question, vague, and I have one detailed question. Am I allowed to take both?
Yeah, as long as
okay.
I'm allowed to only answer one.
The detailed question is about ME.
Yeah. Okay.
Whether you intend to do necessary means. And quite often I think if we now are exclusively synchronically,
yeah, this is synchronic.
there may be many necessary. I may have a grand plan. I have intention to do some movement for a charity. It would mean that as a necessary part of it that I do something myself.
Yeah.
But that's a very trifling part of the whole thing. It's immensely more important to do something else. So I intend to do a lot of other things, and only if I succeed with them will I actually intend to do the small trifling part. Synchronically, I don't intend.
Yeah.
I may commit myself diachronically to do it later, but it's not, I think, a norm synchronically.
Okay,
and
that's really helpful. That's really, I mean, I think I believe that. And that's why this was a kind of rough formulation, because somewhere in the lecture there's this idea, and it's time to fish or cut bait. I put it that way somewhere else. So, right, the to get to, kind of simpler version, I mean, I intend to be in Lund in June. At some point, I gotta get an airplane ticket, but there's still time, and there are other things I got to do. Okay, so I'm not means and incoherent yet. Okay, the way I'm thinking about it is there's going to come a time when you have to fish or cut bait. Okay. And that's compatible with what you said, which is you can put it off, right? And that the norm, more carefully formulated, would have it's time to fish or cut bait condition. And I think that's the way I did it. I can't remember which slide that's on. But so I'll just accept your point that I'm just accepting your point. Yeah.
So that sort of leads over to my more general question.
Good.
My general question is, what sort of entities are plans?
Okay,
are they proposition-like entities? Because and what sorts of inner structure? Because have they conditional components? And when you speak about rationality, coherence, consistency, I can think about many ways of applying these to more complex structures than sentence-like entities.
What was the last thing?
To sentence-like or proposition-like entities, because you can have much more subtle distinctions on more complicated entities.
Yeah. Oh, that's terrific. First of all, there's a kind of ambiguity in talking about plans. You could be talking about what you were just talking about, which is a kind of proposition-like object. Or maybe, I said in my first lecture I was influenced by Hector Neri Castaneda, so maybe these are practicians or something. Okay. Anyway, there's an abstract object of a sort that has a complex structure. Might be the sort of thing that you could write on a blackboard, maybe, So and it could have a complicated conditional structure. If the ticket prices go low, buy today. If not, wait. In any case, work on your paper, right? That's my plan, my Lund plan, right? Okay. So that's a kind of quasi-propositional object. Okay. Then there's plans in the sense that intentions are plans, which is maybe a more accurate way of describing it is planning to, which is a feature of your psychology. So I mean, you could write down this very complicated plan, and I can say, oh, that's a charming plan, but that's not my plan. I don't plan to do that, okay? So intentions are plans in the sense that they're planning to, but the content will have some relation to these abstract objects you just described, okay? So you could also just entertain that content without planning to do it. Oh, that's an interesting plan. Or you could file it in a way it's like we do with recipes, a way of getting to Lund, a way of making coq au vin, right? It's a plan for making coq au vin, but that's not planning to make coq au vin, right? Okay. So getting back to your question, I changed the slide, but when I say intentions are plan or plan states is what the official terminology is. What I mean is planning to, but that the contents will be the sort of objects that you were describing. I have not given you, and I don't have I just think this is a set of questions that's really important, which is how to think about the logic of those objects. Yeah. I've worked with a very simple picture. You intend something, you can intend it conditionally. You could have kind of strings, if this, then that, so long as this, but if not this, right? All that seems to me I could easily just bring on board, but I don't have a deeper logic of plans, which maybe you do, or maybe you could do it for this or something. Yeah, is that a fair answer? You're looking puzzled.
Yeah, I'm thinking about cases where the end state is very diffuse. For example, I plan to get rich when I grow up.
Yeah.
But there's so many means and there are so many contingencies and so on. Would that count as a plan?
I'm not sure. So this gets back to something I said in the first lecture about the difference between intentions and ends in a strict sense. So I'm thinking ends are not, you don't have to agglomerate them without worries about consistency. So as a kid, you might intend to be wealthy and also intend to prove important theorems and also intend to, you can add all those. But I'm not sure I shouldn't put it that way. You might have these as ends. Whether they're intentions, so ends are not ends. Put it this way: life is complicated, and we have ends that we're quite comfortable with there not being co-possible. Okay, it's kind of built into the picture of planning that co-possibility is a demand on plans. Co-possibility relative to your view of the world, anyway. Okay, so that means there are going to be lots of things that are ends that aren't intentions. There's also going to be intentions that aren't ends because they're just instrumental. Okay, so when you think about yourself as a young man with the end of getting wealthy, is that a plan? Well, remember, if we mean by plan, Jess, could you have the object, the abstract object? You could write down, to get wealthy. And call that a plan or a sketchy, but are you planning to get wealthy? According to me, you're only planning to get wealthy if you're in a state that really is guided by these relevant norms of consistency. Now, if you're a kid, who knows, right? But the point is you could have ends like getting wealthy that are not co-possible with other ends you have, and after all, the world's complicated and you'll figure it out as time goes by. Plans are subject to these tighter demands of co-possibility. So that's how I would distinguish planning and having as an end. Okay, yeah.
Ronna Bodhi.
Thank you. I'll start with just a comment about the discussion on maximizing self-governance. I think you probably could phrase it in a way that will be clearer, which is maximizing self-governed activity. Because when you say that...
Okay, yeah.
Because it's in the same sense that when you're sleeping, there's no self-governance. There's no self-governed activity.
Oh, that's perfectly. And if that makes it clear, that's what I don't want to think of the reason as a reason for, because it looks like it gets you this odd result. Yeah, and it also seems like an odd way to think about it when you think about it. That is, the reason of self-governance isn't to maximize the number of activities that are self-governing, so you're kind of failing to conform when you go to sleep. It's a reason, so long as you're involved in a certain kind of activity, to make that a self-governed activity. Yeah, conditional reason. Yeah. Okay, we're on the same page.
Okay. Yeah. So I wanted to ask it as a follow-up to John Broom's initial question, and I think now it came up in your explanation of the difference between ends and intentions.
Yes.
Maybe you can do more. Maybe I just need to go back to explain the background, which I should already know, about the difference between aiming and intending. In other words, maybe if that's clearer, then it will also be clearer why intending to go to Harvard, when you know that this will not be co-possible with getting into Stanford, and intending to get into Stanford cannot exhibit self-governance.
Yeah. I think that's exact. I think you really put your finger right on the big issue. In a way, it goes back. Well, you can do it in terms of Harvard and Stanford. I mean, what I kind of alluded to last time when I talked about the Harvard and Stanford example, and there are many of them, examples like that, right? Was, well, you might aim at getting into Harvard and aim at getting into Stanford. Getting into Harvard might be an end of yours. Getting into Stanford might be an end of yours. That's okay. But planning requires a structure of attitudes that's under the pressures for co-possibility. That's going back to our discussion. Okay. So that's a kind of underlying thought. Okay. That's what leads to the thought that in the Harvard-Stanford case, it's a kind of mistake to intend to get into Harvard, intend to get into Stanford, given the background knowledge. But it's not a mistake to be aiming at each. And in fact, that's what you do. You aim at each and let the world decide. That's okay. So there is a distinction that's I'm not defending this distinction on the basis of ordinary language or something. Though I think it kind of fits ordinary language, but there's something deeper going on. There's a difference between your range of concerns, intrinsic concerns, not instrumental concerns, things that you favor, like getting into Harvard and getting into Stanford, or getting wealthy and proving the theorem. Okay, there's a kind of stew. A human agent has a stew of such things, and then there are these structures that are under much tighter constraints of co-possibility, filling in with means, and those are there. They play this role of guiding and organizing and framing. That's distinctive. That's the underlying picture about the kind of the deep significance of these planning structures, and that's why it's important for me to distinguish just having a concern with, or being in favor of, or being attracted to, or finding good getting into Harvard, or aiming to get into Harvard. I'm thinking of aiming as kind of finding it attractive to get into Harvard and being guided by that, at least insofar as I'm working on the Harvard application, and finding it good to get into Stanford and being guided by that. So in filling out the Stanford, so I'm aiming at Harvard and aiming at Stanford. That's okay, but there's a structure that's different than that, that is constitutive, according to me, of the plans, the way plans structure our lives. Let me get back to that slide. And that has these stronger co-possibility and means and coherence constraints. So the terminological difference between, where was that? It's here, right? Let me just find it. Yeah, I mean, the terminological difference, it's not just the terminological difference between intending and aiming. I'm thinking of that as tracking actually something really important. And that's also connects to why I think you should think of planning agency as a distinctive kind of agency. Right? You could have a creature that doesn't make plans, doesn't try to organize his life in that way, and still is an agent who's guided by certain ends and concerns. But there's a big loss there. And then the story goes on. Yeah. Okay? Yeah.
Would you say that in the case of a person who intends both,
well, intends each anyway.
Okay.
Yeah.
Why is that?
Well, if I intend to get into Harvard and intend to get into Stanford, that's a case of intending each. Intending both, you might read as intend to do the following: get into Harvard and get into Stanford. That's even more problematic, because you know that's it. Because you know that's not possible. So that, right? But
so intending each, is this possible? I mean, would you say in this case that you're planning? You planning each? Is that possible? While you're also planning the other?
This is a hard question about. I'm thinking of these as rationality norms, not as kind of necessary constitutive features of an intention. So, and something like ought not implies can, or something like that. That is, if the idea is it's a rationality norm and you can violate it. Okay, you can be inconsistent. Now, how self-conscious you can be about that, that's a great question. But I know in the back of my mind that my friend isn't my dentist, and my friend lives in Sunnyvale, and my dentist is in Millbrae, and I have this dental appointment at noon and a lunch appointment with my friend at noon. And I've got these inconsistent plans. You know, of course, I haven't put them together. Yeah, subconsciously put them together. Yeah.
So one last thing: is it fair to say that ends cannot generate self-governance? It's only plans.
No, it's not fair to say that.
Not fair to say.
Okay, here's why. In a way, this goes back to what I said when I moved from. Excuse me, I'm going to go around this way. So that was this general idea that self-governance has these coherence conditions that we can then associate with rationality. Okay. And there I said, I'm not specifically thinking about a planning agent here. This is a very general idea. And then I said, but now for a planning agent, it has this more specific implication because okay. So I am not taking a stand on whether or not, in fact, I know what I kind of think, but so here's a question. Can you be self-governing but not a planning agent? As far as I can tell, the answer is yes. Of course, you will not, your self-governance will have a different flavor, as it were, right? Because it won't have these kind of framing plans involved in it. But if you think about the Frankfurt model of self-governance, you need a coherent standpoint that guides. Nothing I said precludes the possibility of satisfying those kind of quasi-Frankfurtian conditions without being a planning agent. Okay. So if you did, then presumably what would be going on would be certain other attitudes would be constituting your standpoint, your concerns, or something like that. Okay. The crucial point for me is once you're a planning agent, then your self-governance has a distinctive character. And it's that distinctive character that we need to explain the relation between these rationalities, the planned rationality norms and self-governance. It's self-governance of a planning agent that we need, which is not to say all self-governed agents are planners. I mean, maybe, for example, angels, to take a realistic example, maybe angels can be self-governing but aren't planners if you think that being a planner is somehow tied in this Herbert Simon way to resource limits. Right? So angels don't have these kinds of resource limits. They can constantly refigure things out. I'm not sure if they still maybe if they face incommensurable or non-comparable problems, then they may still need to be planners. But anyway, you see what I'm saying? Okay, good. Then I'll stop.
So I was wondering something about the ME principle.
Yeah.
Whether you would say that if you intend E and know that there isn't any means to achieve E, are you then sort of rationally forced to give up that intention?
There's a version of that in which my answer will be yes, but I have to be careful. Okay. So if you think, suppose you intend to get to Lund. Well, or let's take an example. Bjorn the other night, there was a point he said, I can't go back to that island tonight. Right? So, right, because the last train had left or something like that. Okay, so let's think about Bjorn there at the restaurant. If he intends to go to the island tonight, he knows that a necessary means to going to the island tonight is taking a train, and he knows that there is no train. Then if he holds on to the intention in favor of the end, it looks like he's going to intend something that he knows isn't going to happen. And that's, where were we? Where was that? That's the second, that's this one. Right. So this gets back to, it's part of the picture. I've been talking about intention consistency and plan consistency to include several different things, and I think probably because I've been proceeding informally, I never really spelled this out in great detail, but it's to include intending something, intending different things that you believe aren't co-possible. It's also to include, you violate this norm of consistency if you intend something that you believe won't happen. It's not a condition that you believe it will happen. That's not inconsistency, that's just kind of pessimism. But it is inconsistency to intend it and believe it won't happen. And that's, okay? Is that a fair answer? Okay, good, good.
Mattias Gunnemyr.
Right, thank you. This might be going ahead of things, but I'll ask anyway. I think there might be cases where planning agency and self-governance doesn't fit together. Might be anyway. Say that I am a planning agent, self-governing, hopefully, with a lot of friends and family and work and stuff like that. So I have a lot of shared plans with my friends, family, and at work. And then I get a job offer, attractive job offer in another state, which will, if I accept, it will interrupt all these plans I have with my friends, and probably not with my family. They might move together with me. I don't know. But in this case, if I stay, just because of the plans I have, the shared plans, which, well, I can't really change them. I can't change the ends of my friends and my family. I can only change my own plans, so to speak. But if I would stay, would I be self-governing, even though I am still a planning agent?
Okay, there are a couple of things going on here, I think. You got a problem.
Yes,
right. I mean, you have a problem. In thinking about the problem, in a way, this is going forward, because I want to say this about shared plans and shared intentions. Suppose you have a shared plan with your friend to run a reading group every Monday night, okay? And this would be endangered by your going to this other place, okay? Let's just get an example, okay? Now, one thing I want to insist on is if you give up your side of that, so you no longer, according to me, and we're actually going to talk about this next time, according to me, for it to be true that you and your friend share an intention or a plan to run a reading group, what constitutes that is, in part, each of you intend that you together run the group. So there's an intention on the part of each that you run the group. So it's not like the shared intention kind of floats free of the minds of each. It's constituted by the minds of each suitably connected. Okay? We'll talk about this more next time. Okay. So if you give up your part of it, it's not like that shared intention's still around. Now, it might be you had implicit commitments to your friends such that there are kind of obligations on you not to give up your part of it. You have to worry about that. Maybe you made a promise. Maybe it's just obligations of friendship or duties of friendship or something. I mean, there's all sorts. We do a lot of normative moral philosophy here about what the what the normative constraints are that have been induced by this shared intention or plan. But I don't think we should think of that as something like the shared plan hovers on, like the smile of the Cheshire Cat, even though you give up your side of it. Though giving up your side of it might have been wrong to do because you had obligations. Okay, having said all that, if you are going to be self-governing with this is in a way getting back to John Broom's question. If you're going to be self-governing with respect to this job, the issue of this job, you need to get your head straight, right? And it turns out, given the complexities of life, that getting your head straight means either giving up your part of this shared intention to run the reading group or giving up your intention to take the job. Okay? That's your problem. And I'm not going to be able to solve it, right? And but I don't think it shows you that self-governance is in tension with being a planning agent. It shows you that if you're a planning agent, your self-governance requires getting your plan straight. And there are a number of ways of doing it, and there are all sorts of issues about the morality of interpersonal relations that will come up, and I haven't even begun to address those. Okay?
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks. So this is a follow-up, I take it, on some previous questions, and it concerns the two different ways of working towards goals. So you can do it by planning, and you can just work towards goals. And if I work towards getting into Harvard and work towards getting into Stanford, that might be just fine. But if I plan to do, if I intend to get into Harvard and plan to get into Stanford, there's a problem here.
That's what I've been saying.
If I get it right.
But
so
I won't. There's something I want to say, but I won't say it yet.
Okay.
Stop me.
Right. So I wonder what the difference consists in. And one natural thing to say is that if I plan, if I make intentions, then I commit myself to consistency. With other things of that sort. And then you'd get, just from that, you'd get an internal norm of consistency. So the internal constitutive norm. So, but then I wasn't here for the first lecture, so I might be missing something. So this is a clarificatory question. So why doesn't that give us the norm already? So there is an internal norm to planning or intending, a consistency norm. And insofar as I'm engaged in this activity, then I have a reason internal to that activity to stick to this norm.
Okay.
But then what else is needed?
Okay, good, good. So, first of all, footnote. You could. This doesn't get at the real hard question. Okay, but just the footnote. You could be aiming at Harvard and aiming at Stanford, where I've distinguished that from intending, and still do a lot of planning, because with respect to the aim at Harvard, you need to plan kind of when you want to fill out the Harvard form. With respect to the aim of Stanford, you're going to plan about when to fill out the Stanford form, and those plans had better be co-possible. So, for example, if the Harvard form requires being at a certain library, and the Stanford form requires it being at a different library, then you've got to get those plans to be so it's going to be a lot of planning, even if the end guiding the planning isn't itself an intention. Okay, okay. And those plans, those sub-plans, are going to be subject to these copossibility and means and coherence norms. Okay. Okay, so that was just footnote. Now, I agree with the basic thought that in intending, one has an attitude with respect to which no, sorry, put it this way. One has an attitude, a systematic feature of which is its guidance by a kind of implicit norm of consistency and coherence. Okay, that's part of the theory. Yeah, that's why I say these acceptance of these norms is in a sense partly constitutive of being a planning agent. They're not constitutive of being an agent, but of being a planning agent. Okay. But that doesn't solve my problem. It poses my problem. My problem is, given that that's what planning is, if you're reflective about it, what should you think about this guidance by these norms? Why, if I'm talking to Nico Kolodny, he's going to say, what are you worried so much about? Is this kind of a fetish for metal tidiness? What's the big deal? Okay. So that point that this form of practical thinking is norm guided by these norms that's what now poses our problem. On reflection, would that be stable? That's the driving question of these lectures. So it's not enough to say, since they're guiding you, you have a reason to conform to them or something like that. That's the inference we don't have a right to yet. I want to be able to say, okay, I'm repeating myself. Okay, so that's why I agree with much of what you said, but I think insofar as what you said was supposed to answer my question, it doesn't yet.
So if I just step back, so I realize that getting into Harvard and getting into Stanford are inconsistent, and I just step back and continue to aim at each.
Yeah.
Are you committed to saying that that's a problem? I've
lost
lost
cool.
something of value.
That's actually no.
Okay.
That's exactly how we deal with these things. We don't put them in, strictly speaking, into this plan structure. But we still have them as concerns or aims or ends.
Okay.
And now, if we're doing that in part because we're sensitive to the consistency demands that we get into once we put them into the plans,
right?
That's kind of what. So that's fine. But now we have this question: why are you shaping your thinking by those demands? Now, of course, I want an answer to that, and that's what I'm trying to give you. Does that make sense? Is that okay?
Yes. Okay. So maybe tomorrow we'll.
Okay. Good.
The rest.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you very much again, and thanks for a lively discussion.
Okay.
So we'll
thank you
stop
very
here.
much. Yeah.